It's a great pleasure to welcome our second speaker today, Dr. Chris Munn, who, like our first speaker, Dr. Patrick Hase, has both worked in Hong Kong and written a lot about Hong Kong history. His most recent book is called Penalties of Empire, Capital Trials in Colonial Hong Kong. The format for this afternoon's, or this first panel this afternoon, is slightly different from this morning's. Chris will give a short presentation. I'll ask a few questions, and then we will open the floor. As with before, we will have about 75 minutes or so in total. So Chris, over to you, please.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Robert, Vivian, and Ray for this event. And thank you all for coming today on this sunny afternoon. I'm really encouraged by so many people interested in Hong Kong history. Can you all hear me? Yes. Thank you. This is not a pleasant subject. It's a really, in places, quite depressing. But it is important because the ability or the power to kill somebody is probably the greatest power that any state can have. And in Hong Kong during colonial times, particularly during early colonial times, the death penalty was used quite frequently. It was used even more frequently in some other colonies, but in Hong Kong it was a tool of punishment, and also it had certain other symbolic uses. The presentation will be quite short. I'm going to ask 5 questions, 5 fairly practical questions. What offences were punishable by capital punishment? How many hangings were there? What sort of people were hanged? Where did the hangings take place? And who did the hanging? The book itself is actually more about the process of trial and the aftermath of trial, including the exercise of mercy, than it is about the actual hangings. So it's more about trials than about punishment. And this is the structure of the book. The introduction explains how the system worked. Then there are 9 chapters, each of which describes one case in detail and in context. And there are a variety of different cases. Some of them are at flashpoints in Hong Kong history, beginning with the famous mass poisoning attempt in 1857, but including one that took place during the 1922 seaman strike. Others are piracies, which were endemic in certain decades in Hong Kong history, the 1850s, 1860s, and also the 1920s, times when the Chinese state was weak and the control over the seas was not strong. There are political assassinations, crimes of passions, love triangles, and robberies, and some murders that nobody can really understand what the reason was. And then the last 2 chapters, they talk about the surge in capital punishment immediately after World War II, because Hong Kong was in a chaotic state, and then the gradual decline during a decade of peace from the mid-1950s to the mid or late 1960s, and then the suspension in 1966, the announcement in 1975 that no more people would be hanged, and then formal abolition in 1993. So that's the structure of the book. But let's go back to those questions, and we'll look briefly at the kind of offences that were punishable by hanging. Next slide. I'm only really highlighting here the red ones because those were the most common. But bear in mind that when Hong Kong was first colonised by the British, English law, more or less in full form, was adopted in Hong Kong. And so up to 1865, when the law was reformed, all of these offences were technically punishable by hanging, although in Hong Kong, as in England, apart from murder, piracy with violence, and a few other crimes, most of those convicted of these other crimes had their sentences commuted to imprisonment or transportation to other colonies. From 1865, it was really just three main offences that affected Hong Kong: murder, piracy with violence, and high treason. High treason, particularly in a few cases after World War II. But there were some special measures in Hong Kong the early 1950s, when gangsterism and terrorism was rife. Certain special offences were introduced on a temporary basis. As we said, the last execution, 1966, 1975, the announcement that all future capital sentences would be commuted, and then the formal abolition. Now, how many hangings took place in Hong Kong? And what sort of people were hanged? We'll take this together. Now, these are estimates, some more accurate perhaps than others. The estimate is that these look like tidy figures, but I think they're pretty close to the real numbers. 750 capital trials took place during this period when people could be hanged. And these involved about 1,500 defendants. Most trials were just one person, but many were 2 or 3, or even, in the poisoning case, even 10 or 11. Now, of these, 573 were sentenced to death, and a further 185 were sentenced to something called death recorded, which means they would not be hanged. We can go into that later if you like. And others were convicted of lesser crimes after trial, such as manslaughter. And of the 573 sentenced to death, 375 were hanged. We've got detailed figures in the next slide. The summary is on the right-hand side, but you'll note, if you can read the decade or quinquennium by quinquennium figures, that there were some years when nothing really happened, including a period in the late 19th century when 11 years passed with no hangings at all. But there are also some years, particularly the early decades, when there were very many people hanged. Some years more people hanged than in the whole of England and Wales, not in relative terms, but in absolute terms. But the summary on the right gives the total. 319 were convicted of murder. The others were usually for piracy with violence. And of these, 373 were men. Only 2 women were hanged, as far as we can work it out. There's one year, 1941, where the records are not very good, but I'm pretty sure that that's right. Maybe in that year a few more men were hanged. It's difficult to tell. And a breakdown by origin or ethnicity. As you can see, nearly all of them, I think 95% were Chinese, which is not surprising given the population makeup. 29 were other Asians, South Asians, Malays, and some people from further afield, the Philippines and so on. And 11 were Westerners. So the idea that no Westerners were hanged in Hong Kong, it is true of some colonies. Some colonies went out of their way to avoid it. But in Hong Kong, there were Westerners hanged, and there were about half a dozen were hanged for killing Chinese, which is a surprise to some historians of other colonies. Where were the hangings carried out? Now, the book, really, as I said, it deals more with the trials and the exercise of mercy by the governor in council, whether to hang or not to hang. I didn't really look very closely at where the hangings were carried out, but I thought this is a key question, particularly in a small and crowded place like Hong Kong. And there were 3 main places. First 10, 12 years was at West Point. The next batch is in what's now known as Tai Kwun, originally in the magistrate compound and then within the jail. And then finally, when Stanley Prison was built, the hangings took place in a special execution suite there. These are the figures. And you'll see that the majority, actually, something like 212, I think, took place in Tai Kwun, which is actually a really large number. because if you think of the locations in England, I won't look at Bristol because not many people were actually hanged here, but if you look at London, the big prisons there, such as Newgate in the 19th century, Pentonville in the 20th century, they were roughly the same figures, but for a much larger population. So it's quite striking that in that very small space, so many people were put to death. And then finally, in the last few decades, as the population expanded, up to 1966, 127 executions, not including the Japanese war criminals who were also hanged there. So the first location, the arrows, the left-hand arrow points to the jail, Victoria Jail, now Tai Kwun, and the location of the hanging is on the right-hand arrow. It's a place that was known as Edger's Bungalow, Edger's Bungalow. Edger was a merchant, an early member of the Legislative Council. He had a bungalow there. They didn't take place in the bungalow, but they were very close by on this prominent place, which at that time was very close both to the Chinese district and also a very large squatter settlement. Here it is in the late 19th century, long after the hanging ceased. It was the site of a hospital, the civil hospital, and some of you may notice that little road and wall in the middle still exists. Here it is roughly today. It's the Jan Yuk Hospital, which began as a maternity hospital and is still a hospital that looks after children and mothers. It's rather ironic that this was originally a place of death. Now it's a place of life. And the next slide is an example of how the hangings took place. They were in public. The prisoners, including the man who was going to be hanged, were marched from the jail, I think it's over a mile, escorted by soldiers. Often they were in chains, and they would all be shown the hanging, and members of the public were expected to watch it too. And they were brutal affairs. They were nasty, and in fact, it's also true of England. The methods were very rough. The hangmen were not experienced, and here's an account of a couple of three pirates. They didn't kill anybody. They were convicted of a violent piracy, and this is a letter. It's probably not legible here, or maybe it is, which is written by somebody anonymous who'd witnessed it, an English, possibly a soldier or sailor, who was disgusted. It was nothing more than a piece of brutality acted towards the condemned prisoners. And this is just an example. There were many others where they would have to pause the hanging and start again, and some cases where the hanged men were saying, "Fai di, get on with it, do it." This is not the hanging apparatus used in Hong Kong. This is an example from England, from Oakham in Rutland, and this sort of equipment was used in England until the late 1870s, and probably in Hong Kong until roughly after that, and it was called the short drop. There was you can see the noose and this platform, which is really a trapdoor, and a lever would pull the trapdoor, and the hanged person would fall only a few feet, 3 or 4 feet, which meant that he was strangled, and this was the method. And strangulation can it can take a long time, and that was the method used in early Hong Kong. Then from the 1850s, the mid-1850s, the location was just outside the magistracy on Arbuthnot Road, the old magistracy, which is pointed to with this arrow. The present magistracy was built in about 1915. It's slightly bigger. This one had a much bigger area around it, and it was very visible from the streets, from the buildings around, from the rooftops around, and the idea was, of course, that people should see it. Here it is shown on a map, and that is the old Magistracy building. This is a map from about 1860 something. Arbuthnot Road is on the left-hand side. This is the location roughly today, although it's the new Magistracy building. This is now, I think it's called the Botanical Garden, and it's a gin palace, basically. It's attached to a very fancy restaurant called the Magistracy, a very expensive restaurant. Now a garden, originally a site of death. We think it was there. It may have been around the front, but most likely it was here. Those steps and the archway are original from the 1860s. Next slide. And here's an example. Charles Newman, an American, who'd killed a man who he thought was trying to take away his lover, Portuguese man. And he pretended he was insane for a while, smeared his cell with feces and behaved in a very strange way. And then he decided, well, he was caught out, but he also said, you know, I'd rather be dead than live out the rest of my life in Victoria Jail. So he confessed, and his hanging was allegedly attended by hundreds of people, including six or 700 people on that compound or nearby. I don't know how they all squeezed in, but this is the account in one of the newspapers. And then there were more people in the road below. Now the people who attended these hangings, there tended to be more Europeans than Chinese, according to the reports. So you know, it was a popular event. Now we move to inside the jail. It's much more difficult to work out quite where in the jail these took place, because by the 1890s, the hangings were held in private in Hong Kong, no longer on public view. The press were allowed in for a few years until the reporters got a bit too colourful, and then they were completely private, just with the man to be hanged, the hangman, the governor of the jail, and clergymen, and the physician who would make sure the man had been hanged. And there are various descriptions here. I won't go through them, but they all sort of converge on a place which is in the next slide. This is a map of Tai Kwun. It's the other way around. That's the Magistracy on the left. Sorry, on the right, I beg your pardon. And it was one of these two places. I think it probably moved from one to another during these years. And that's probably the place when the jail became much more crowded, with more buildings being built in the early 20th century. Next slide. And this is probably the site today. That staircase is an addition. There was another staircase going up. And one of the reasons why they needed a kind of vertical site was that the method of hanging changed, as I said, in the late 19th century, from the short drop to the long drop. And the long drop it could be 10 or 12 or 13 feet. So it needed a staircase to go up. And the idea was that the neck would be broken immediately, or the vertebra would be dislocated. This is an example of what it looked like. This is not Hong Kong. This is Hull, Quebec, in Canada. And this was supposed to be a private hanging, but you can see that there are people climbing up telegraph poles and on rooftops and balconies. But the main point of this is to show the long staircase leading up and the long drop underneath the trapdoor. Then Stanley Prison had a special execution suite and had a large capacity and was a state-of-the-art jail. Next slide. And in the museum at Stanley Jail, there is a mock-up of the old execution suite with inside a room next door to the condemned cells with a trapdoor leading down below. This is still there today. It's a mock-up, not the original. Now, who were the executioners? Well, we have a list of some of them. These are not all, but they were identified often in in the newspapers or in other colonial documents. The earliest, we're going to single out 4 of them. The earliest was Mughal John from India, and then we'll talk about him in a minute. Another one, J.P. Kingston, a prisoner, a jail turnkey, destitutes kept in the jail, European destitutes, and so on, until by the 1920s, the main hangmen were jailers, some of whom had been trained, but not always. Now, one thing to notice here is that none of them is Chinese. They are all non-Chinese, some Americans, some English, some people of color, but none of them Chinese. And the same goes for the flogging that took place in the jail or even in public, always by non-Chinese. Next one. We'll look briefly at some of the hangmen. Mughal John was from Madras. He was hangman for about 5 years until in 1849 he was himself convicted of larceny, theft, and sentenced to 10 years transportation and sent to Penang. J.P. Kingston was an American sailor convicted of shooting another American sailor in the leg during a drunken fight, 10 years penal servitude. His sentence was reduced on condition that he hanged all the Chinese during those 3 years. Now, during those 3 years, no Chinese were sentenced to death, or at least their death sentence was not confirmed. In 1861, he was asked to hang a Malay, Abdullah, and he said, that's not part of the deal. But he nevertheless did it and got out. And then we have a jail turnkey, a kind of jailer, a low-ranking jailer, of South Asian origin. And he himself had just got off being tried for murder the year before he was involved in this first hanging in 11 years of Li Yao. Emin Dean had allegedly murdered a love rival who he thought was taking away he'd had a long-standing quarrel with him, but he was acquitted after a very long trial, a 3-day trial, very long in those days. And he carried on in the jail. He nearly died when he didn't move away from the trapdoor, so he at least nearly broke his leg. Retired in 1895. And finally, Bert Plum, aptly named, I guess, for a hangman, jail warder for 20 years, possibly a former military man, and I think one of the record years for hanging, probably not the record, 1927, when there were 2 huge piracies, and he hanged 15 of them were pirates, and was paid $50 for each hanging, which is a very large amount of money, and he bought a motorbike out of the proceeds, allegedly. In 1930, he was nearly killed himself. Prisoner had been put up for flogging. He'd been pressing his bell over and over and over, and had been causing trouble, and he was sentenced to, or awarded a flogging sentence, and he stabbed Bert Plum in the neck. Then in 1936, a rare case in the British Empire where he bungled a hanging. The rope snapped, and the man, who was another Indian, survived, although with an elongated neck, and was commuted. His sentence was commuted. There were technical problems which I won't go into. Then the last we hear of him is actually it's more in 1945 when he was shipped back to England, but in 1941 as the Japanese converged on Stanley, the last big battle in the Battle of Hong Kong, he was among the people from the jail, including a number of prisoners who fought the Japanese. He was interned during the war. I think that's it. Yes, it is. Thank you very much. Thank you. Over to you, John.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. I have a long list of questions, but I'm well aware that others may have questions too, so I'm going to ask a few, and then we'll open things up. And the first is I want to ask about hanging as the form of execution. And I'm just wondering if there is ever any discussion of other forms of execution. The reason I ask is because, as you know more than anyone, some colonists believed that Chinese people were afraid of soft British justice, right? That they believed that they could only really understand their own traditional kind of punishments, right? That they only understood sort of hard Chinese justice. And I should also add that it wasn't just British colonists. Some Chinese elites believed this as well. Did anybody ever advocate Chinese forms of execution instead of hanging?
Yes, thanks for raising that, especially your last point. Do I need that? Is that better? Thank you especially for the last point, because the impression I may have given, especially when we look at non-Chinese hangmen hanging mostly Chinese, is that this was pure colonial oppression. But it wasn't, because the Chinese elites, the merchants, the shopkeepers, basically the victims of crime, whether it was violent crime or non-violent crime, they, as much as or even more than the British elites, wanted severe punishment for various reasons, mainly because punishment was very severe in China itself, and they believed that hanging was a deterrent, which it possibly wasn't. But the answer to your question is that under British rule, all of the executions were carried out by hanging, without exception. There was the period of Japanese rule where countless people were executed either judicially or otherwise by other means, by beheading, by firing squad or whatever. There was discussion about enhancing the way that people were killed. They came up from time to time, particularly in the 1860s during the period of piracy, when one clever editorialist observed that in China the most severe punishment was beheading, or rather ling chi, which was death by slicing, and the body was basically dismembered or even disappeared, which was a violation of Chinese religious beliefs, the idea that your body should be intact in the afterlife. And this editorialist, who was a nasty piece of work, I think, he said, why not, after the hanging, why don't we just chop them all up? This would be a much better deterrent. It didn't happen, but there is an interesting report that in about that period, when craniology or phrenology, the study of the shape of people's heads, as a sign of whether they were criminal or not, was in vogue. And when the bodies were sent to some were sent to the civil hospital for post-mortem and sometimes autopsy, there was a collection of skulls. I don't know where the collection went. I hope it's no longer here. But there were skulls that were kept for that purpose. But there was also some talk about using the gas chamber. Using electrocution. The gas chamber, I don't know whether it came in. But as early as the late 1870s, when some of the colonists in Hong Kong were calling for a hanging, they said there's been no hanging for a long time, and they were discussing methods. And they talked about electrocution, which was then, I think, gaining ground in the US, but it didn't happen.
Thank you. Just talking about the hangmen, you mentioned that none of the hangmen were Chinese. What was the particular reason for that?
Until after World War II, none of the jailers, with a few exceptions, was Chinese. The exceptions were during Governor Hase's time. And Hase is the well-known liberal governor who tried to bring in a degree of equality, both in justice and in the handling of punishment. He appointed 4 Chinese turnkeys, some of them from the police. But within a year, I think, 3 of them had resigned because they were threatened by the people they'd put into jail. And one of them, I think, was kept for a few more years, and he ran off with the prisoners' money. And I think the decision was that the Chinese were just too exposed to the people they were dealing with. And so the jailers were mostly Indian, Sikh, Muslim, and some Hindu, and also Europeans, mostly English, mostly former military men. And the problem was that although the Indians, many of them could speak quite a bit of Cantonese, the Westerners, some of them could, most of them couldn't, or they only understood the most basic. There was a booklet that was produced I think in the 1890s. I think it was described as terms that are used by Low Cantonese. I guess they were mostly swear words and slang words, so that they could attempt to communicate. But it does seem, and this is noticeable because in the blue books, the annual statistics, there are marks against staff names about whether they get a language allowance. Very few of the Europeans had that. Many of the Indians did.
Thanks. Somewhere in the book, I think it's in a footnote, you mentioned that one of the hangmen ended up becoming a health and safety advisor at a British holiday camp.
Yes.
Was that typical?
I hope he's not still alive, and if he is, I hope he's not in the audience today. This was Richard Bridicum Woods, and in the 1990s there was another. He was a former jailer in Hong Kong, and there was another former jailer called John Fleming, who became, I think, a car dealer on Lantau Island. I don't know how that worked when cars were very restricted, but apparently that's what he did. Fleming claimed on a TV show, I think it was Wicker's World, that he was the former hangman, and he'd hung so many people. And then it was repeated in the local newspaper. Bridicum Woods then said, no, I was the hangman. This Fleming had no idea, and he wasn't involved. Either way, it was a very unsavory discussion and debate, nothing to be proud of. But Bridicum Woods, yes, he ended up at Butlins, I think, or Pontins, as a health and safety advisor. Quite a character, according to people who remember him.
Right. Thanks. So chapter 7 of your new book has the title, I Will Smile Even When I Am Hanged. And it's about the Victoria Jail murders of 1919. Assistant Warder Harman Singh, the other warden is James Speed, who we saw up there earlier, and the trial of a man named Wong Gong. Yes. This is a particularly interesting case because it draws attention to the plight of the warders, and it reveals questions of trust between government and non-European staff. Is this why you chose that case?
Yes, mainly to show what life was like in the jail, and as you say, not just for the prisoners. These were four men conspired to escape. I think a couple were in for 10 years for robbery, one for kidnapping. One was near the end of a 1-year sentence for returning from deportation, which was a criminal offence. They conspired together. They made suits in the tailor's shop to change into. They made daggers in the tinsmith shop. They made a key in the tinsmith shop. And one night, I think it was December, close to Christmas, they acted upon all of that, and they escaped, murdered James Speed and Harman Singh very brutally, I mean, really brutally. And they escaped through a tunnel that goes under Old Bailey Street, still there today, into what was then the prison annex. Later it was police quarters, now I don't know what it is. They escaped over the wall into the Club Lusitania, the Portuguese club, frightened to death one of the staff sleeping on the top floor, and they spread out and they were caught one by one. Wong Guang the next day, the others over the space of about 2 years. 2 of them were actually caught in China by police teams that used to go over the border. They didn't care about the jurisdiction in that direction. And they were tried one by one, and 2 of them, the first 2, Wong Guang and Mok Sing, I think it was, Wong Guang gave a crazed account of life in jail about how they were being starved to death, how they didn't have enough warm clothes, how some of the warders were actually giving sweets and cigarettes to the nice-looking prisoners so that they could have sex with them, and so on and so on and so on. And it was a very emotional account. And this was in court, and they couldn't stop him. This was at the end of the trial, where the prisoner is asked, do you have anything to say whether sentence of death should not be passed upon you? And he just went on and on and on and on and on, and he'd already given a statement to that effect. Mok Sing said similar things, but he said it much more calmly. And as a result of these complaints, there was an inquiry, a very large commission of inquiry into life in the jail, which sort of validated what was going on. This was at the end of World War I, and there were rice shortages. There was a shortage of flannel cloth, so they were not given proper clothes in winter, and there were certainly some strange things going on. And this triggered a very slow path to reform. Certainly it gave them better food after a year or two, at least for a while. And it eventually, after about 15 years, led to the construction of Stanley Prison. So it was a key event. It was a very unpleasant affair, and Speed became a bit of a hero. There's a gravestone to him in the Catholic cemetery, which actually records the whole episode. It doesn't name the prisoners who escaped, but it describes the crime. Very rare kind of grave inscription.
Right, thanks. I don't think you mentioned it here, but you do in the book, this idea of death recorded. And death recorded is when the judge believes somebody deserves the death sentence, but does not have him executed, or her, and simply writes down recorded sentence of death. What was the advantage from the judge's point of view of doing such a thing? And did it happen very often?
Yes, it did happen often up to the 1870s, or mainly the 1860s, when it sort of faded out. Because after 1865, it could not apply to murder. And after the late 1860s, murder was the main offence. And what it meant is that the judge, who along with the jury was the best judge of whether somebody had mitigating factors, the judge could say, I'm not pronouncing death upon you, I am recording death. And it wasn't essential that the governor who confirmed or did not confirm death sentences, it wasn't binding upon the governor, or in England upon the king or the Home Secretary, or the Queen at that time, but it was almost without exception, it was followed. In fact, there were 1 or 2 disputes between the governor and the Chief Justice over the use of this, when the Chief Justice sentenced death recorded, and the governor didn't like what he was doing, especially with piracies. But it's a confusing term, because death recorded, the natural assumption is it means that somebody died and it was recorded, but it really means the opposite. And many mistakes have been made. A recent book by Naomi Wolf, I think, had to be pulped, because she thought that men convicted of homosexual offences were still being hanged in England in the 1860s, but they weren't. They were being sentenced to death recorded. And even in Hong Kong, the judicial statistics by the late 19th century, early 20th century, they had a column, death recorded, and it's very clear that death recorded meant who was actually hanged. So it's a confusing term. It faded out because it no longer applied to murder. But even in the early 20th century, one of the judges, Pigott, fairly radical judge, he did a death-recorded version of his own where he didn't agree with the jury, and he held the black cap up, the traditional black cap that judges put over their wig when they sentence people to death. He held it up and said, I'm only formally sentencing you to death because I don't believe that you are guilty. And the governor and council, they felt compelled, because it was all in the press, they felt compelled to follow that.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds like it could be rather controversial at times. And yes. Something else that I think was controversial was commutation. And I think the most famous case is probably that under Governor Murray MacLehose, when public opinion was clearly for the death sentence, and it didn't quite work out that way, fortunately. Why commutation? Why was it controversial at times?
It was controversial at this time because in the late 60s and early 70s, the crime rate in Hong Kong, particularly violent crime, shot up. It was doubling almost annually, and these were mostly robberies, muggings that resulted in death. Not many domestic murders, but really nasty, violent cases. This case, 1973, Choi Kwok Cheung was a no-gooder who, with a gang of friends, late one night after getting drunk at a wedding banquet, they went into a shop in Yuen Long, or near Yuen Long, with sharpened paint scrapers, which they bought earlier in the day, hoping that, or expecting to have a fight with somebody. They found the shop owner and her friends playing mahjong late at night, in the early hours of the morning, and robbed them of a very small amount of money. The shop owner was Chu Jiao, and her husband and sons were sleeping up in the cock loft. Actually, one of the sons was doing homework at 2 a.m. And she shouted up in Chujiawa, help, there are robbers. And the father and the elder son, who was about 20, came down the ladder. The elder son was stabbed in the heart during a dark, the lights were off, and there was a lot of confusion, and he was stabbed. Now, Choi said it wasn't deliberate. In fact, he didn't even know that the man had died when he fled. And at that time, though, and I think still in Hong Kong, if you kill somebody in a robbery, or if somebody is killed, whether it's deliberate or not, you can't really be convicted of manslaughter, or you shouldn't be. He was convicted of murder. The victim was an auxiliary policeman, and he worked in Yuen Long District Office. So he was, a bit different from the usual victims. MacLehose was under pressure from his executive council to do something. The death penalty had not been formally abolished at that point, and people still thought it might be used, even though it had never been used for 7 years. MacLehose was about to launch a fight crime campaign, and he or his advisors thought, well, what better than a hanging? And it wasn't quite as explicit as that, but there was preparation. It's very clear from the files that they were thinking along those lines. And he declined to commute the sentence. There was uproar in Hong Kong among the more liberal community, the religious figures, the lawyers, the academics. There were petitions to London, to the Queen, and eventually, and this was a time when the death penalty was being debated in England, whether to restore it for certain offences, whether to abolish it in Northern Ireland, where it was still current. So it was MacLehose said that it wasn't deliberate, it was an accident, the timing, but the coincidence was very unfortunate, and there was even a fear that it might bring down the British government, because the questions of the death penalty were conscience votes in Parliament, and there was a divide within the Conservative Heath government. eventually the Queen commuted it on the advice of ministers. And then there was further uproar in Hong Kong among the people who wanted hanging to be restored. This was a key event because this was the time of the Godber case. It was almost within a month. So there was this huge sort of divide between Hong Kong opinion, which the governor supported, and opinion or political opinion in the UK. And after that, a system was devised for a few years whereby any difficult case where MacLehose thought he could not get support for commutation, the decision was his alone. He took advice, but he decided. Any difficult case would go back to London, the trial transcripts, the probation reports, loads of documentation, and experts in the Home Office would see if they could find reasons for mitigation, whether the man had drug problems, broken home, or difficulties with evidence. This went on for a few years. Now, I know Ray Yep has been doing a lot of writing on autonomy during the MacLehose period, whether MacLehose really had the freedom to do his own thing and the initiative that he was assumed to have. And Ray gives a number of examples, but this is yet another example of where control was taken out of his hands. And he was told, for as long as the Labour government came in shortly after, and he was told very clearly, for as long as there is a Labour government, there will be no hangings in Hong Kong.
Okay. Thank you. I want to just ask one last question, and here I'll be also interested in hearing what members of the audience think. More than half of the hangings here took place in one place, Tai Kwun, as you've discussed. And I'm wondering how we present, we interpret, we commemorate this kind of history, right? A history of cruelty and suffering in a place that, as many of you know, if you have been to Tai Kwun today, is known mainly as a place of pleasure and recreation. As Chris mentions, the hangings took place in a bar that is today called well, it wasn't a bar then, right? In a place that today is called the Botanic Gin Bar. This is sometimes called difficult heritage or dark heritage, dark tourism, and so on. It usually involves places that are associated with dark histories, such as prisons, cemeteries, disaster sites, and so on. So I'm just wondering how you think everything you've talked about today, how it should be commemorated in Hong Kong history.
Yes, this is a really difficult question, actually. And when Tai Kwun was being restored and renovated, the idea of having a restaurant in the magistracy, I found a bit distasteful, because the magistracy, these murder and piracy cases took place in the Supreme Court, but nearly everybody else, for practically any other crime, unless it was serious robbery, was tried in the magistracy and tried in a very abrupt and very rather peremptory way, and often given very heavy sentences and treated very badly in jail. The short-term prisoners were the worst treated of all prisoners. And the kind of offences that existed in early Hong Kong, they had no equivalents in England. Opium offences, very severe gambling offences, returning from deportation, which I mentioned, and so on and so on. So I felt a little bad about it. But of course, we've eaten in the magistracy. It serves traditional English food, very heavy, quite stodgy, but quite good. And I have to confess that my partner and I, Nick, our next stop is Oxford Prison, which is now a hotel. So I hope we're not staying in a cell the size of the cells in Hong Kong. It is difficult, but speaking more seriously, I'd say that one of the interesting things for Hong Kong is that so many of the public buildings that are of any great age are police stations, prisons, places of dark places, as you put it, and magistracy buildings, courthouses. And because the courthouses and the prisons and some of the police stations have been modernized, they are redundant and have to be used for something. So, you know, I do know that there were quite a lot of feng shui ceremonies in Tai Kwun, including apparently the feng shui man said that area I showed in the slide was a particularly bad, dirty area as far as feng shui goes. But you have to make do. But I think in terms of commemorating, I'm not keen on the sensationalization, which you sometimes get. I think you get it more in this country than in Tai Kwun, which has been done, I think, quite professionally. They've got some very good people there with international experience, some of them with experience in the UK and the US. And I think they've tried to tread a very narrow path between making everything look really terrible, but also, you know, trying to explain why this was the reality, the poverty that existed in Hong Kong, the class and racial prejudices, and as far as the prison goes, the tightness of space. This is why this wasn't a reason for hanging people, but it was a reason for flogging people and for putting them in the stocks in the streets. So there are all kinds of factors, but I would say if people can go and just see what it was like, and perhaps enjoy a bit of food and the performance, why not? You know, I don't feel so bad now, particularly since it might appear hypocritical if I criticize it.
Yes, well, thank you. You keep the mic.
Okay.
Let's open it up to questions. That was the first. Fastest hand, yes. And maybe I learned over the lunchtime that some people in the back have a hard time hearing the questions. So maybe you could speak as loudly as possible and try to keep your question as short as possible.
Thank you. There's always a saying in Hong Kong from a childhood up to now. Once upon a time, there is an image is going to be held, the hanging. Mm-hmm. But when he held it, it fell. It's still alive. Then afterward, the government has to change the law, hanging to death until you die. Mm-hmm. Is it? Can you verify this?
Yes.
A story or just
no. Thanks for raising that. Yeah, because the original phraseology used by a judge. The question is, was there a policy to hang until you die? Right. The original phraseology used by the judge was, you know, you shall be taken from this place and you shall be hanged by the neck until you're dead, and God have mercy on your soul. That was shortened, I think, as late as the 1950s to you'll be hanged according to the law, something like that. But you know, technically it is as you say, and people were left hanging for about half an hour after the actual death was alleged to have taken place, just to make sure they were dead. And that was the policy in England. Hong Kong copied England in that respect. And then there would be a post-mortem, a compulsory post-mortem within 24 hours by a jury and the magistrate or the coroner, who was the same person, just to make sure, you know, that the person was dead. The physician would check. And that was the old practice in England. In Hong Kong, it had become a bit of a formality because it was usually pretty clear that the person was dead. But yes, in that case from Quebec, from Canada, which I showed the picture of the scaffold, actually it wasn't that case, it was another picture I got, sorry. But there was a man who was hanged 3 times because each time he was, this was in England, sorry, I'm confused, jet lagged. In England, there was a man who was hanged 3 times, and every time, for some reason, it didn't work. And eventually he was pardoned. So what you say is not just a phrase, it's actually policy. But the man in Shanghai, Bert Plum, was the hangman for people sentenced to death by the British court in Shanghai, the extraterritorial settlement, which only dealt with British national criminals. And the Sikh policeman was technically a British national. The problem there was the rope snapped because in Hong Kong, the hanging as you see in the Stanley Jail picture, the beam, piece of wood at the top, was rounded. In fact, I think originally they used bamboo, according to some descriptions. In Shanghai at that time, they had a modern apparatus, which was a square steel girder, and the corner of the girder frayed the rope, and it snapped. That man was lucky. I mean, the authorities didn't know what to do. They didn't know whether, should we hang him again? Should we let him go? And they wrote back to London. They telegraphed back to London. This was in the 1930s. And eventually they said, well, poor guy, you know, he's quite badly injured. His neck has gone, and his throat is very badly injured. He recovered. And they sentenced him to life imprisonment. Now, he probably would have ended up in the Hong Kong jail because the prison in Shanghai, well, maybe it was a bit more complete at that time. But there's this interesting connection between, this judicial connection between Hong Kong and Shanghai, which is, I think, worth researching further. Thank you for that question.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I'm interested in two or maybe three aspects, and so I will come up with three questions. The first one is about the two female prisoners who got hanged at the end. Is there any special stories behind, or any things that you have dug up in your research about these two female prisoners who got hanged? The second one is, at the end, we know that this capital punishment has been abolished, and we understand that it's sort of like a gradual from suspension to abolitions. So could you share with us like some of your observations?
Yeah.
How it comes up at the end that it will be abolished, in particular against still maybe the Chinese background about the reason why I asked this question is related to the third question. Is I understand that in Taiwan they still have this capital punishment. Actually, I myself have done some exchange with the lawyers there, and then they want to know about how come in the Hong Kong history that we have this death penalty abolished, and then is there any experience that they can look for, and then they can try to persuade to have this movement done, and because they find it so difficult to push forward this abolition of the capital punishment. So I would like to borrow your expertise in this regard. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Those are interesting questions. I'll deal with them one by one. The first one is about the small number of women, the two women, or possibly three, but I think only two were hanged. There were about a dozen or so other women who were sentenced to death. In fact, in the 1900s, the governor asked the Chief Justice and the Attorney General, do we hang a woman? You know, should we hang a woman? She'd poisoned her husband, 1908. And they both said, oh no, it's no longer the policy in England to hang women. So she was reprieved. But then they got a reply back saying, well, actually, reply from London, saying we're a bit surprised because we've hanged about 20 women in the last few years. So this is an example of confusion and misunderstanding, not just between cultures, but within a culture. But the two women who were definitely hanged, one of them was a woman called Chan Pat, who was, I don't know whether she was a Soi Seung Yan, a boat dweller, but she was a woman married to a fisherman in Aberdeen. And the dispute is unclear, but her husband was quite elderly, meaning at that time probably 50-something, because that was described as elderly. And she was younger. And she conspired with an employee, I think, or a colleague, to drown the husband. They pushed him over their sampan while they were fishing and kept him in the sea with a bamboo pole until he drowned. And this is perhaps a good example of what Pat Hase was talking about this morning, about how the urban world doesn't, in the trial they said we don't really know what happened or what the cause of this dispute was, because the life of villagers is so mysterious. They have their customs and superstitions which we can't really fathom. But nevertheless, she and the other man, the younger man, were both convicted, and they were not, the sentences were not commuted. This was about 1920-something, 1920-ish. And they were hanged together within Victoria Jail. There is a little report about how this lady, as she walked to the gallows, she was singing a folk song or a song, and the man with her said, "Shut up," shut up. That's the story that got out into the press. So that's one example. The other example is rather sad, and I think is 1940, and this was in Saiwan or Sai Ying Pun, and it was a case of a man with a wife and a concubine living together with children, and as so often happened, and not a very rich family, but the wife was older than the concubine and was treated badly by both concubine and husband. And one night, the wife just got a chopper out and started chopping everybody, and I think she killed some of the children as well. And it was a horrific case. Most domestic cases, they would often find a reason for commuting the sentence because they're often on the spur of the moment. But this one was so horrific that they decided to hang her. But there's another case in 1941 where somebody described as a very small woman, I think a similar case where she'd been oppressed by her husband and eventually it just got too much and she chopped him as well. But the judge and the jury both recommended mercy, and I can't find any record in the press of any hanging. My guess is she was reprieved. But the idea that these humble people were ignorant and superstitious was actually, as in other colonies, it was a factor in their favor if a murder took place, because there was a sense that they didn't understand the law, they didn't understand what they were doing at the time. There's an interesting case from the New Territories, from the Yuen Long area, Ao Tau, where in 1934, a woman and her daughter were being so badly treated by the husband. The husband had threatened to leave them with nothing and to go back to the mainland. They, with the help of another villager, strangled and hit the husband over the head, and the mother and the daughter were put on trial. But he didn't get very far, partly because one of the policemen, I have to say the police were utterly incompetent during this period. They didn't know what they were doing. Policemen said, "You better tell the truth, otherwise there will be consequences." Now, they used that as an excuse not to take it any further, because I think they were sympathetic with the woman. The man, by the way, was buried by torchlight, face downwards on the mountainside. Everybody hated him. He was the village bully. Now, sorry, I'm going on and on, but the abolition question, gradual, because contrary to what happened in England, gradual abolition was what happened in most European countries. They stopped hanging people, partly because people found it distasteful, partly because the crime rates were low, partly because they realized it didn't work as a deterrent. And it was very much the same in Hong Kong. As I said earlier, in the late 50s, early 60s, the crime rate was low. Hong Kong was relatively peaceful, and there weren't many hangings, actually. So it was already fading out even before 1966. But then, of course, in the 70s, the demand grew. Now, Taiwan is interesting. There have been a few hangings, very few hangings in the last few years, quite a lot earlier on. And I understand, you probably know better, but I understand that the method there, if you could use the word, is quite humane. The prisoner is given a bottle of Chinese rice wine with his last meal. He is turned on his face on the floor, and then he's given an injection, an anesthetic injection, and then shot in the back of the head. So I guess there's no danger of pain. But of course, it's a horrible thing. They do have the choice, the judges have the choice in Taiwan, I believe, of whether it should be murder or not. But I'm sorry to go on about all these horrible things, so I'll leave it at that.
We have time for one more question over here.
I mean, I asked, at that time, what was the role of the governor in council? Is that only symbolic? And for the ordinary people, if they want to appeal, is it how difficult for them to go to the privy court at that time? And the final question is there any numbers or cases revealed that after execution, there's unjust cases?
Thank you.
Because at that time, the police corruption.
Yes.
It's likely
Yes.
Terrible.
Yeah. Thank you for those are interesting questions. So the Governing Council, it certainly wasn't symbolic. It was a serious business, and often they would have special meetings. This is the governor and the Executive Council, and it is the governor acting, having taken advice from the Executive Council, but he doesn't have to follow their advice. If he doesn't follow it, he has to report to London. And they often had quite long debates, and some of those debates are recorded in the early years, and only the governor, not his boss in London, only the governor and the king or the queen, who had a residual prerogative, only the governor could decide. And governors had to be reminded of that when they consulted London. Some governors liked hanging, obviously. Some I could name them, but I won't. Some of them had declared in their earlier careers that they didn't like the death penalty. They thought it was abhorrent, and so they didn't hang very many, but they still did. Questions of appeal. Now, up to 1933, there was no appeal court within Hong Kong for criminal cases, but there were methods. And in the early years, there are quite a few cases, several of them capital, many of them not, where somebody was condemned to death or sentenced to transportation or imprisonment, and then there would be mass petitioning and even investigations done by leaders of the Chinese community and missionaries saying, these people, they weren't even in Hong Kong, they were about 100 miles away when the crime took place. And sometimes they had mini trials in the Executive Council with the prisoners present and lawyers present to act as a kind of appeal court, and usually successfully, at least in about half the cases. The question of the Privy Council, yes, technically you could appeal to the Privy Council, but up to about World War II, it was too expensive. There were efforts to do so, but the Privy Council always said, we are not a court of criminal appeal. We are only here if there is a really serious miscarriage of justice where, something really terrible has gone wrong. So I don't think any of the cases from Hong Kong, there were only a handful. The first one was in 1914, and that was somebody another Indian who'd murdered somebody in Guangzhou, tried in Hong Kong. None of them was successful. After the war, there were quite a few cases, and they were given legal assistance, I think, from the late 1940s onwards. But I think only 2 or 3 resulted in either commutation or reduction to manslaughter or a complete exoneration. So it was a rich man's court, the Privy Council. It was mainly commercial disputes, not criminal. Thanks for the question.
Last question for you, Chris, and that is the title of your book. It's called Penalties of Empire. Now, I know that if you look at the back of the book, the title will be explained, but not everybody's going to have time to look at the book immediately. So please tell us the title.
Very briefly.
Very briefly.
And this
1
is,
minute.
1 minute. Yeah. This is an example of how justice worked. This was a case in 1909 when 3 chair bearers, the Sedan chair bearers working up on the Peak, were put on trial for killing a man after a very petty dispute. He dirted the man's clothes on the Peak tram, and they had a fight with bamboo poles, and this man was killed. The three of the chair bearers were put on trial. They were non-Cantonese speakers. They were Hoklo, which is the border between Guangdong and Fujian. The language was somewhat different from Cantonese. They were given a lawyer, a barrister, to defend them, which was the practice by then, but they were not given any interpretation at all. So not only did they not understand what the Westerners were saying, there were a few Western witnesses, they didn't understand what the friends of the victim were saying in evidence. And at the end of the trial, they were convicted only of manslaughter because the jury couldn't be bothered to analyse the case. So to be safe, they said manslaughter. We don't want these deaths on our conscience. And just as the judge was about to pass sentence, their lawyer said, well, they haven't been given interpretation. You know, this is unfair. This is not the English practice. The case went to a kind of appeal in Hong Kong, which was more an appeal on law, which was available at that time, a technical appeal. And it was actually the same judge sitting on appeal. But this was Pigott, the fairly radical, difficult judge. And he said, you know, we have to take this seriously. The Attorney General who prosecuted said, well, that's what we do everywhere else. We do it in Cyprus. They have even more languages there. But the judge said, no, if we're going to hang somebody, we have to have proper procedures. That is one of the penalties of empire. It was not penalty was not hanging or imprisonment or whatever. It was the burden, the white man's burden that the British took on. And he said, if we have an empire of millions of people, we have to do, even if it costs a lot of money, we have to do justice properly. From there on, defendants were given proper interpretation. And this case is one of the few Hong Kong criminal cases from these early years that actually became a worldwide precedent. It's even, I think, cited today. It's been cited in several jurisdictions. Thank you, John. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you. Thanks, John.